Miss Rettig, who has gone through this every day for months, sits patiently and waits for his fiendish glee to subside, and then reminds him, as she has to do a dozen times a day, that such a number is not yet possible under the company's regulations. She hastily adds that of course it will be possible when Mr. Pettifoss finally gets complete charge of the company. Somewhat mollified, Pettifoss snarls for a while, but in the end agrees to stay within bounds. He writes down all the tough arrangements of authorized numbers he can think of and tries them out on Miss Rettig. When she stumbles several times, trying to say New Milford 1006W1, he claps his hands and okays the change. It hasn't been such a bad day after all, and Rudwool Yermurm Pettifoss goes home in what for him are high spirits to kick his children's rabbits around a while before sitting down to dinner. Backward and Downward with Mr. Punch. Looking for a Roman coin I had dropped on the library floor of the house I rented for the winter, I found on a shelf behind a sofa 24 immense bound volumes of Punch. They contained all the copies of the famous British weekly from the year it was founded until 1891, exactly half a century later. I picked out 3 volumes at random and began idly turning the pages of first one and then another. When the following Tuesday found me still at it, I realized what I was up to. I was getting ready to make some kind of report on Mr. Punch of the 19th century. If it has been done before, all I can say is that I am doing it again. Let us begin, then, with the tome which contains the issues from July 1889 to July 1891, and work our way back toward the Civil War. This volume, like all the others, contains some rather heavy introductory notes summarizing what was going on in the world at the time. In this 2-year period, quite a lot was going on, if you have forgotten. The young and impetuous Kaiser Wilhelm was rattling his saber and already disturbing the peace of mind of Europe. The volume falls open easily at the double page containing Tenniel's famous cartoon, Dropping the Pilot, for it was at this time that Wilhelm got rid of Bismarck. Socialism was raising its troublesome head, so terrifying Mr. Punch that he had Tenniel draw a cartoon of a serpent, socialism, wrapped about the body of an eagle, trade, and striving to crush the bird's wings, capital and labor. The brief, sad romance of Parnell and Captain O'Shea's wife shocked the British Isles and formed a dark foil for the decorous private life of Mr. Gladstone, who, past 80 years old, celebrated his golden wedding anniversary. Tennyson, the poet laureate, became an octogenarian in his turn, and Browning died 2 years short of the mark. A potato famine was predicted in Ireland, and an epidemic of influenza held the world in what I am sure Punch, somewhere or other, must have called its grip. A young pianist, whom Punch laughingly alluded to as a Paddy Revsky from Irish Poland, gave a concert in London, but Punch could not appraise the young man's talents because Punch did not attend the concert. Punch could report, however, that the life in Marion Crawford's latest novel was real life, and that Mr. Ibsen's A Doll's House was unutterably loathsome and should be removed from the stages of the world. The harsh effects on the feminine complexion of that new invention, the electric light, gave Punch 100 whimsical ideas, and so did the new and wonderful Eiffel Tower. One proud London paper wrote, "The Eiffel Tower is 1,000 feet high. The fourth bridge, if stood on end, would be 5,280 feet in height." Mr. Edison's phonograph was received with proper respect, Punch calling up the spirit of Faraday, who solemnly approved of the device. Montana, the Dakotas, and Washington were admitted to the Union, and the government breathed more easily when Sitting Bull was shot dead. Barnum was in London with his great show, and Millet's The Angelus was sold to an American. A hydrophobia scare led to the muzzling of all the dogs in England, and Punch came out for the much-abused Pasteur in a drawing with this dialogue between a husband and wife. "Oh, Joseph, Teddy's just been bitten by a strange dog. Doctor says we'd better take him over to Pasteur at once. But, my love, I've just written and published a violent attack upon Monsieur Pasteur, on the score of his cruelty to rabbits, and at your instigation, too. Oh, heavens, never mind the rabbits now. What are all the rabbits in the world compared to our only child? Among the minor objects of Mr. Punch's annoyance during these years were Mr. Pinero for an attack on the London music halls, newfangled barbed wire fences for interfering with fox hunting, the Americans for coining so much money and so many new words, and Count Tolstoy for a savage assault on tobacco smokers. Of this last, Punch rhymed in part, "Tolstoy knew a man who said he cut off a woman's head, but when half the deed was done, lo, the murderer's courage gone, and he finished, 'tis no joke, only by the aid of smoke." Unhorrified by murderers who got a lift from nicotine, Mr. Punch could not approve of the use of the weed by ladies, some of whom were apparently going in for cigars. "You're beautiful, but fairer far you'd be if only you would let your male friends smoke that big cigar, and yield them to that cigarette." Most of the jokes in this volume are about bad cooks, worse painters, errant nursemaids, precocious children, insolent cab drivers, and nonchalant young blades in ballrooms. I found, somewhat to my surprise, that a great many of these young blades were named Gus. I found also to my surprise that the expression, "I'm nuts on," meaning I'm crazy about, was used in 1891, and that the irate voice from upstairs joke began 50 years ago, unless what I ran across was just a revival of it. Stern voice from first floor landing, tempus 12:10 p.m. "Alice?" Alice, softly. "Yes, Pa." Voice with threatening ring in it. "Does that young man in the front parlor take tea or coffee for his breakfast?" Door, and he was gone. During the 80s and 90s, Mr. Henry James, of whom I could find no mention anywhere in Punch, was in the midst of his elaborate and delicate examinations of American ladies abroad, but Mr. Punch lashed out at them in a simpler manner. Sir James: "And were you in Rome?" American lady: "I guess not." To her daughter: "Say, Bella, did we visit Rome?" Fair daughter: "Why, Ma, certainly. Don't you remember? It was in Rome we bought the lisle thread stockings." American lady is convinced. The American male comes in for it, too. Young Britisher: "Your father's not with you, then, Miss Van Trump?" Fair New York millionairess, one of three: "Why, no, Pa's much too vulgar. It's as much as we can do to stand Ma." Sometimes Punch had it our damsels in verse. The American girl: "She guesses and she calculates, she wears all sorts of collars. Her yellow hair is not without suspicion of a dye. Her papa is a dull old man who turned pork into dollars, but everyone admits that she's indubitably spry. She did roam in a swift 2 days, gave half the time to Venice, but vows that she saw everything, although in awful haste. She's fond of dancing, but she seems to fight shy of lawn tennis, because it might endanger the proportions of her waist. Her manner might be well defined as elegantly skittish. She loves a lord as only a republican can do. And quite the best of titles, she's persuaded, are the British. And well she knows the peerage, for she's read it through and through. She's bediamonded superbly and shines like a constellation. You scarce can see her fingers for the multitude of rings. She's just a shade too conscious, as it seems, of admiration, with irritating tendencies to wriggle when she sings. She owns she is American, and her accent is alarming. Her birthplace is an awful name you pray you may forget. Yet after all, we own La Belle Américaine is charming, so let us hope she'll win at last her long-sought coronet. Phil May, the great caricaturist, came back to London in the early 90s after a long stay in Australia, but his work does not appear in this volume. It could have used some. Before I leave this engrossing period of history and humor, I must quote a typical foreigner in the English home joke. This one, with its evidence of the 19th century Englishman's fine ear for the German accent, is my favorite of several hundred. Hostess. Won't you try some of that jelly, Herr Silbermund? Herr Silbermund, who has just been helped to pudding. Ach, thank you no. I would rather pair with the ills we have than fly to others we know not of. In the years 1869 to 1871, our second volume, Mr. Punch had a wealth of subjects for his little punning pieces and his big political posters. The Fenians in Ireland and America were raising hell on behalf of the freedom of Erin, and the Alabama claims case was still a sore point between England and America. Harriet Beecher Stowe, having freed the slaves, nosed about in the private life of the late Lord Byron, and provided the great scandal of the day in a magazine article revealing the love story of the poet and his half-sister, Augusta Lee. General Dan Sickles, hero of the peach orchard at Gettysburg, who was god-damning up and down the American Chancellery in Madrid as our ambassador, informed his government that the Spaniards were sore about our friendly attitude toward the Cuban insurrectionists, and might do something about it. On the 18th of July, 1870, the infallibility of the Pope was declared. On the next day, France declared war on Prussia, and rushed headlong to defeat, the French mitrailleuse proving less deadly than the Prussian needle gun. Disraeli published a novel called Lothair, and made Bartlett's quotations with a crack about critics being people who have failed in literature and the arts. Oxford beat Harvard in the first crew race ever rowed between the two universities, and a small, resolute band of women began to clamor for the right to vote. Darwin's The Descent of Man was pie for the wits of Punch, and the magazine cried out against the deplorable fact that the word reliable, which it described as a new and unnecessary American adjective, was creeping into the inviolable English tongue. On top of everything, the women of England were affecting the Grecian bend, which Punch called an exaggerated forward inclination of the body, an absurd fashion of the hour. I devoted a great deal of my research to hunting down 70-year-old versions of jokes which are still going the rounds, and I offer my most cherished discovery. The Curate. Oh dear, drunk again, Jones, drunk again, and in broad daylight, too. Jones. Lorsh, hic, what's the odds? So am I. You will remember this one, too. Ticket collector. Now then, make haste. Where's your ticket? Bandsman, refreshed. I've lost it. Ticket collector. Nonsense. Feel in your pockets. You cannot have lost it. Bandsman. I cannot? Why, man, I've lost the big drum. Throughout this volume, there runs a series of drawings of cute kiddies above the most distressingly cute captions. If the researcher rapidly tires of the pen and ink drawings of the famous Georges-Louis Paméa Buisson du Maurier, the gentle, graceful satirist of modern fashionable life, it is perhaps mainly because of the gags he is given to illustrate. I select the ickiest of them. A mother is about to give a dose of medicine to a 2-year-old girl. Master George whispers, I say, Kitty, has Mama been telling you she'd give you a lovely spoonful of delicious currant jelly? Oh, so nice, so very nice. Kitty. Yes, currant jelly. Oh, so nice, so welly nice. Master George. Then don't take it. Du Maurier's husbands and wives are pictured engaged in what are surely the most depressing conversations ever recorded in the history of civilized man. I quote the first, but not necessarily the worst of those I come to in my grim notes. Well, dearest, where have you been tonight? Monday pops again? No, Celia, I have spent a most instructive evening with the Anthropological Society. The how much, darling? The Anthropological, Celia. Are you deaf? How nice. And where do they anthropologe, duckums? I shall end my discussion of this fond old volume with a caption that for its simplicity and point rose out of these fusty yellow pages like a little cool wind. I like to think this is one the author of Trilby thought up himself. It appears under a drawing of a dowager in a carriage drawn by 2 horses and surmounted by a coachman and a footman. The lady has just given alms to a poverty-stricken woman whose ragged children are gathered about her knees. Grateful recipient. Bless you, my lady. May we meet in heaven. Haughty donor. Good gracious. Drive on, Jarvis. It grieves me to report that Punch was unable to let it go at that. In parentheses and italics there follows this explanatory line. She had evidently read Dr. Johnson, who didn't care to meet certain people anywhere, just in case you hadn't caught on. In the year 1863, our third and last volume runs from July 63 to July 65, the newly married Edward and Alexandra were cheered everywhere they went. The great Blondin was walking the tightrope in the Crystal Palace, and a young woman who imitated him at a small-town carnival fell and broke her neck. The Russians were beating up the Poles, and Schleswig-Holstein was the Czechoslovakia of the year, and of the next. Louis Napoleon announced that the improvements brought about by civilization would render war still more destructive. Disraeli said, "The condition of Europe is one of very grave character. Let us be sure, if we go to war, first of all, that it is a necessary and just war." The Japanese killed an Englishman named Richardson and committed a savage assault on an Englishwoman and 2 friends. Garibaldi visited London, and the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birthday was celebrated. Punch was irritated by the clamor in the streets caused by organ grinders and hurdy-gurdy men, and hucksters selling watercress and prawns. There is no mention in the volume of what must have been to Punch one of the minor events of the early 60s, the Battle of Gettysburg. Mr. Punch's snipes and jibes at Abraham Lincoln and the cause of the North are too well known to call for an extended examination, but the researcher will cite 2 because he wants to append some notes of his own to them. Instead of habeas corpus in the United States, which has been suspended, it is now, in the case of the prisoner who is arbitrarily arrested, Abe who has corpus. Researchers note, the English government, which was apparently unswayed by Punch, suspended the right of habeas corpus in Ireland in 1866. Latest American Telegrams, 1864. Grant reduced to grunt. Sheridan's rivals successful. Hunter hunted. Pillow on Sherman's rear. Researcher's note. The Encyclopedia Americana on Pillow, Gideon J., American soldier. After 1861, he did not figure in any battle save Murfreesboro, in which he had a courtesy command. Murfreesboro was fought some 20 months before Punch's little crack. You might also be interested in a diatribe printed January 21st, 1865, and headed to the Yankee Braggarts. This American crisis is one which is only to be met by the most unmitigated swagger, and Mr. Punch, hastily constituting himself head swaggerer to the English nation, hereby answers the Yankee journals with shouts as loud and shrieks as fierce as their own. Researcher's note. Somebody had got off some remarks in America about our being able to lick England. War with England, indeed, you long-necked, wizened, ugly, ignorant Occidentals. Defy the flag that has braved 1,000 years the battle in the breeze. Laugh at the lion and give umbrage to the unicorn. Bah! Bosh! Shut up! Tremble! It goes on to say that one Sir Hugh Rose could go over and lick the whole United States. This happened to be the first time I had ever heard of Sir Hugh, but maybe Grant and Lee knew who he was. The end to all this is well known. Tenniel drew a touching cartoon showing Britannia laying a wreath on Lincoln's bier, and Tom Taylor wrote an equally famous and equally touching poem, eating all of Punch's nasty words, and all of Tenniel's nasty drawings. This, incidentally, was the year that Alice in Wonderland was published, the book that gave Mr. Tenniel something really important to do. I find no mention of it in Punch. Lincoln and the North might be forgiven, but America's pernicious invention of new words wasn't. If the pure well of English is to remain undefiled, said Mr. Punch, no Yankee should be allowed henceforth to throw mud into it. It is a form of verbal expectoration that is most profane, most detestable. He gives you an idea of what he has in mind a few pages farther on. Two American ladies are pictured at a dance, with a young beau standing by. Says one of the ladies, under the heading, Yet Another Americanism, "Here, Maria, hold my coat while I have a fling with the stranger." American ladies were invariably represented as pretty and well-shaped, in spite of Mr. Punch's purple anger at one Nathaniel Hawthorne, sometime American consul at Liverpool, who had brought out a book about England thoroughly saturated with what seemed ill nature and spite, and making a savage onslaught upon our women. Excerpts are quoted, but I have space for only one. "English girls seem to me all homely alike. They seem to be country lasses of sturdy and wholesome aspect, with coarse-grained, cabbage-rosy cheeks. How unlike the trim little damsels of my native land." Mr. Punch hopes that Mr. Hawthorne will go on to write an autobiography, for Mr. Punch is very partial to essays on the natural history of half-civilized animals. I will close this survey with a typical illustrated joke of those years of pain and sorrow. It is labeled "Gentle Rebuke," and the caption will give you some idea of what the drawing is like. Old Gentleman: "How charmingly that young lady sings. Pray, who composed the beautiful song she has just favored us with?" Lady of the House: "Oh, it is by Mendelssohn." Old Gentleman: "Ah, one of his famous songs without words, I suppose." Moral: Young ladies, when you sing, pronounce your words carefully, and then you will not expose unmusical old gentlemen to making such ridiculous mistakes as the above. Has anybody got any bound copies of old almanacs? The Man Who Hated Moonbaum. After they had passed through the high grilled gate, they walked for almost a quarter of a mile, or so it seemed to Tallman. It was very dark. The air smelled sweet. Now and then leaves brushed against his cheek or forehead. The little stout man he was following had stopped talking, but Tallman could hear him breathing. They walked on for another minute. "How we doing?" Tallman asked finally. "Don't ask me questions," snapped the other man. "Nobody asks me questions. You'll learn." "The hell I will," thought Tallman, pushing through the darkness and the fragrance and the mysterious leaves. "The hell I will, baby. This is the last time you'll ever see me." The knowledge that he was leaving Hollywood within 24 hours gave him a sense of comfort. There was no longer turf or gravel under his feet. There was something that rang flatly, tile or flagstones. The little man began to walk more slowly, and Tallman almost bumped into him. "Can't we have a light?" said Tallman. "There you go!" shouted his guide. "Don't get me screaming! What are you trying to do to me?" "I'm not trying to do anything to you," said Tallman. "I'm trying to find out where we're going." The other man had come to a stop and seemed to be groping around. "First it's the wrong uniforms," he said. "Then it's red fire in Scotland, red fire 300 years ago. I don't know why I ain't crazy." Tallman could make out the other man dimly, a black gesturing blob. "You're doing all right," said Tallman. "Why did I ever leave the brown derby with this guy?" he asked himself. "Why did I ever let him bring me to this house, if he has a house? Who the hell does he think he is?" Tallman looked at his wristwatch. The dial glowed wanly in the immense darkness. He was a little drunk, but he could see that it was 3:30 in the morning. "Not trying to do anything to me, he says," screamed the little man. "Wasn't his fault. It's never anybody's fault. They give me $10,000 worth of Sam Brown belts for Scotch Highlanders, and it's nobody's fault." Tallman was beginning to get his hangover headache. "I want a light," he said. "I want a drink. I want to know where the hell I am." "That's it. Speak out," said the other. "Say what you think. I like a man who knows where he is. We'll get along." "Contact," said Tallman. "Camera, lights. Get out that 100-year-old brandy you were talking about." The response to this was a soft flood of rose-colored radiance. The little man had somehow found a light switch in the dark. God knows where, thought Tallman, probably on a tree. They were in a courtyard paved with enormous flagstones, which fitted together with mosaic perfection. The light revealed the dark stones of a building which looked like the Place de la Concorde side of the Crillon. "Come on, you people," said the little man. Tolman looked behind him, half expecting to see the shadowy forms of Scottish Highlanders, but there was nothing but the shadows of trees and of oddly shaped plants closing in on the courtyard. With a key as small as a dime, the little man opened a door that was 15 feet high and made of wood 6 inches thick. Marble stairs tumbled down like Niagara into a grand canyon of a living room. The steps of the two men sounded sharp and clear on the stairs, died in the soft depths of the immensity of carpet in the living room. The ceiling towered above them. There were highlights on dark wood medallions, on burnished shields, on silver curves and edges. On one wall, a 40-foot tapestry hung from the ceiling to within a few feet of the floor. Tolman was looking at this when his companion grasped his arm. "The second rose," he said. "The second rose from the right." Tolman pulled away. "One of us has got to snap out of this, baby," he said. "How about that brandy?" "Don't interrupt me," shouted his host. "That's what Hooses whispers to what's-his-name. Greatest love story in the world, if I do say so myself. King's wife mixed up in it. Knights riding around with spears. Hooses writes her a message made out of twigs bent together to make words. 'I love you,' sends it floating down a stream past her window. They got her locked in. God-damnedest thing in the history of pictures. Where was I? Oh, second rose from the right," she says. "Why? Because she's seen it twitch. She's seen it move. What's-his-name is bending over her, kissing her maybe. He whirls around and shoots an arrow at the rose. Second from the right, way up high there. Down comes the whole tapestry. Weighs 1,100 pounds, and out rolls this spy, shot through the heart. What's-his-name sent him to watch the lovers." The little man began to pace up and down the deep carpet. Tolman lighted a fresh cigarette from his glowing stub and sat down in an enormous chair. His host came to a stop in front of the chair and shook his finger. "Look," said the little man, "I don't know who you are, and I'm telling you this. You could ruin me, but I got to tell you. I get Moonbaum here. I get Moonbaum himself here. You ask Manny or Saul. I get the best arrow shot in the world here to fire that arrow for what's-his-name." "Tristram," said Tolman. "Don't prompt me," bellowed the little man. "For Tristram, what happens? Do I know he's got arrows you shoot bears with? Do I know he ain't got caps on 'em? If I gotta know that, why do I have Mitnick? Moonbaum is sitting right there. The tapestry comes down, and out rolls this guy shot through the heart. Only the arrow is in his stomach. So what happens? So Moonbaum laughs. That makes Moonbaum laugh. The greatest love story in the history of pictures, and Moonbaum laughs." The little man raced over to a large chest, opened it, took out a cigar, stuck it in his mouth, and resumed his pacing. "How do you like it?" he shouted. "I love it," said Tolman. "I love every part of it. I always have." The little man raised his hands above his head. "He loves it. He hears one, maybe two scenes, and he loves every part of it. Even Moonbaum don't know how it comes out, and you love every part of it." The little man was standing before Tolman's chair again, shaking his cigar at him. "The story got around," said Tolman. "These things leak out. Maybe you talk when you're drinking. What about that brandy?" The little man walked over and took hold of a bell rope on the wall next to the tapestry. "Moonbaum laughs like he's dying," he said. "Moonbaum laughs like he's seen Chaplin." He dropped the bell rope. "I hope you really got that 100-year-old brandy," said Tolman. "Don't keep telling me what you hope," howled the little man. "Keep listening to what I hope." He pulled the bell rope savagely. "Now we're getting somewhere," said Tolman. For the first time, the little man went to a chair and sat down. He chewed on his unlighted cigar. "Do you know what Moonbaum wants her called?" he demanded, lowering his heavy lids. "I can guess," said Tolman. "Isolde." "Birds of a feather," shouted his host. "Horses of the same color. Isolde. Name of God, man, you can't call a woman Isolde. What do I want her called?" "You have me there," said Tolman. "I want her called Dawn," said the little man, getting up out of his chair. "It's short, ain't it? It's sweet, ain't it? You can say it, can't you?" "To get back to that brandy," said Tolman, "who is supposed to answer that bell?" "Nobody is supposed to answer it," said the little man. "That don't ring. That's a fake bell rope. It don't ring anywhere. I got it to remind me of an idea Moonbaum ruined. Listen. Louisiana mansion, guy with 7 daughters, old Southern Colonel stuff. Lionel Barrymore could play it. We open on a room that looks like $1 million. Barrymore crosses and pulls the bell rope. What happens? Nothing, said Tallman. You're crazy, bellowed the little man. Part of the wall falls in. Out flies a crow. In walks a goat, maybe. The place has gone to seed, see? It's just a hunk of its former self. It's a shallows. He turned and walked out of the room. It took him quite a while. When he came back, he was carrying a bottle of brandy and 2 huge brandy glasses. He poured a great deal of brandy into each glass and handed one to Tallman. You and Mitnick, he said scornfully, pulling walls out of Southern mansions. Crows you give me, goats you give me. What the hell kind of effect is that? I could have a bad idea, said Tallman, raising his glass. Here's to Moonbaum. May he mull things over in his mind all night and never get any spontaneity into them. I drink nothing to Moonbaum, said the little man. I hate Moonbaum. You know where they catch that crook? That guy has a little finger off one hand and wears a glove to cover it up. What does Moonbaum want? Moonbaum wants the little finger to flap. What do I want? I want it stuffed. What do I want it stuffed with? Sand. Why? I know, said Tallman, so that when he closes his hand over the head of his cane, the little finger sticks out stiffly, giving him away. The little man seemed to leap into the air. His brandy splashed out of his glass. Suitcase, he screamed. Not cane. Suitcase. He grabs hold of a suitcase. Tallman didn't say anything. He closed his eyes and sipped his brandy. It was wonderful brandy. He looked up presently to find his host staring at him with a resigned expression in his eyes. All right, then, suitcase, the little man said. Have it, suitcase. We won't fight about details. I'm trying to tell you my story. I don't tell my stories to everybody. Richard Harding Davis stole that finger gag, used it in Gallagher, said Tallman. You could sue him. The little man walked over to his chair and flopped into it. He's beneath me. He's beneath me like the dirt. I ignore him. Tallman finished his brandy slowly. His host's chin sank upon his chest. His heavy eyelids began to close. Tallman waited several minutes and then tiptoed over to the marble stairs. He took off his shoes and walked up the stairs carefully. He had the heavy door open when the little man shouted at him. Birds of a feather, all of you, he shouted. You can tell Moonbaum I said so, shooting guys out of tapestries. I'll tell him, said Tallman. Good night. The brandy was wonderful. The little man was not listening. He was pacing the floor again, gesturing with an empty brandy glass in one hand and the unlighted cigar in the other. Tallman stepped out into the cool air of the courtyard and put on one shoe and laced it. The heavy door swung shut behind him with a terrific crash. He picked up the other shoe and ran wildly toward the trees and the oddly shaped plants. It was daylight now. He could see where he was going. Death in the Zoo. Naturalists, who are easily baffled by the behavior of animals, are still wondering why Big Bill, a polar bear at the Fleischhacker Zoo in San Francisco, killed his mate Min so unexpectedly. Bill was lying down, strumming at the bedboard with his fingers, dreaming of the ice floes or trying to remember where he had put something, when Min tiptoed into the room. Tiptoeing again, thought Bill, like a gaddarn poodle dog. What she said and did in the next few minutes we shall reconstruct later. At the end of it, Bill rolled out of bed and killed her, after which he dragged her 30 feet to a pool of water and held her under for several minutes to make sure. I saw the male polar bear at the Central Park Zoo duck his mate one Sunday last April. He grabbed her ear, pulled her head under, kept her there 10 seconds or so, and then let her go, growling half playfully, "That's for nothing." The Central Park polar bears seem to like each other, which is a break for the zoo attendants, the homicide squad, and the female bear. Perhaps the principal trouble with American zoos as regards bears is that the men in charge of them think that all female bears look alike to a male bear. This conclusion, arrived at from the premise that all female bears look alike to the men in the zoo, is unfortunate to the point of being deadly. To a male polar bear, female polar bears are as different as thumbprints to a G-man. A male polar bear likes only about one female in every 50 he comes across in a day's courting swim. Some bears swim 75 miles along a bear-infested coast before they find a female cute enough to bother with. Not knowing this, the Fleischhacker zoo men brought Bill a mate one spring that he couldn't abide. She put starch into everything she washed, and cheese into everything she cooked. What is more, she kept scratching constantly. Bill swatted her out of existence one day as nonchalantly as if she had been a fly. He was still grumbling about mating conditions in California when the Fleischhacker people brought him still another mate, rousing him from dreams of the Arctic, where a man can have his pick of 1,000 gals. "Look at Bill," they said, "the lady of our choice." Bill noted that she smelled faintly like a Los Angeles rhodoteria, and that she tacked slightly to the left in lumbering, which was going to be bad since he tacked to the right. Furthermore, she giggled. When the zoo men left, Bill told the newcomer to stay out of his way, and he went back to the cave and lay down. When Bill did not come out for several days, Min took to tiptoeing in to see if he wanted a glass of water. She would fiddle with doilies, empty ashtrays, wash out his briar pipe with soap and water, open the window if it was shut, and shut it if it was open. Once she felt his forehead to see if he had a fever, and Bill took a cut at her, but missed. She fled, screaming. When Bill didn't come out for several more days, he felt fine, but he didn't want to come out, she decided that he was sick, and she determined to take his temperature. She tiptoed in and stuck a thermometer in his mouth before he knew what was happening. Bill watched her tidy up his bureau, putting his socks, handkerchiefs, and shirts, which had all been in one drawer, neatly into separate drawers. When she started hanging his ties on a patented nickel-plated cedarwood tie rack, which clasped them in such a way that you couldn't get them off unless you knew how to work the automatic clip-shift tie release, Bill leaped out of bed and roared into action. He finished off her, the thermometer, and the tie rack before anybody could stop him. "They turned hoses on me," he said later, "and that helped. I was getting pretty hot." The Fleischhacker people are probably looking for another mate for Big Bill right now. Well, I have done all I can. The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. "We're going through!" The commander's voice was like thin ice breaking. He wore his full-dress uniform, with the heavily braided white cap pulled down rakishly over one cold gray eye. "We can't make it, sir. It's spoiling for a hurricane, if you ask me." "I'm not asking you, Lieutenant Berg," said the commander. "Throw on the power lights. Rev her up to 8,500. We're going through." The pounding of the cylinders increased. "Ta-pocket-a-pocket-a-pocket-a-pocket-a-pocket-a." The commander stared at the ice forming on the pilot window. He walked over and twisted a row of complicated dials. "Switch on number 8 auxiliary," he shouted. "Switch on number 8 auxiliary," repeated Lieutenant Berg. "Full strength in number 3 turret," shouted the commander. "Full strength in number 3 turret." The crew, bending to their various tasks in the huge, hurtling, 8-engined Navy hydroplane, looked at each other and grinned. "The old man'll get us through," they said to one another. "The old man ain't afraid of hell." "Not so fast. You're driving too fast," said Mrs. Mitty. "What are you driving so fast for?" Said Walter Mitty. He looked at his wife in the seat beside him with shocked astonishment. She seemed grossly unfamiliar, like a strange woman who had yelled at him in a crowd. "You were up to 55, she said. "You know I don't like to go more than 40. You were up to 55. Walter Mitty drove on toward Waterbury in silence, the roaring of the SN-202 through the worst storm in 20 years of Navy flying, fading in the remote, intimate airways of his mind. "You're tensed up again," said Mrs. Mitty. "It's one of your days. I wish you'd let Dr. Renshaw look you over." Walter Mitty stopped the car in front of the building where his wife went to have her hair done. "Remember to get those overshoes while I'm having my hair done," she said. "I don't need overshoes," said Mitty. She put her mirror back into her bag. "We've been through all that," she said, getting out of the car. "You're not a young man any longer." He raced the engine a little. "Why don't you wear your gloves? Have you lost your gloves?" Walter Mitty reached in a pocket and brought out the gloves. He put them on, but after she had turned and gone into the building, and he had driven onto a red light, he took them off again. "Pick it up, brother," snapped a cop as the light changed, and Mitty hastily pulled on his gloves and lurched ahead. He drove around the streets aimlessly for a time, and then he drove past the hospital on his way to the parking lot. "It's the millionaire banker, Wellington Macmillan," said the pretty nurse. "Yes," said Walter Mitty, removing his gloves slowly. "Who has the case?" "Dr. Renshaw and Dr. Benbow, but there are two specialists here, Dr. Remington from New York and Mr. Pritchard Mitford from London. He flew over." A door opened down a long, cool corridor, and Dr. Renshaw came out. He looked distraught and haggard. "Hello, Mitty," he said. "We're having the devil's own time with Macmillan, the millionaire banker, and close personal friend of Roosevelt. Obstrurosis of the ductal tract. Tertiary. Wish you'd take a look at him." "Glad to," said Mitty. In the operating room there were whispered introductions. "Dr. Remington, Dr. Mitty. Mr. Pritchard Mitford, Dr. Mitty." "I've read your book on streptothrombosis," said Pritchard Mitford, shaking hands. "A brilliant performance, sir." "Thank you," said Walter Mitty. "Didn't know you were in the States, Mitty," grumbled Remington. "Coles to Newcastle, bringing Mitford and me up here for a tertiary." "You are very kind," said Mitty. A huge, complicated machine, connected to the operating table with many tubes and wires, began at this moment to go pocketa, pocketa, pocketa. "The new anesthetizer is giving way," shouted an intern. "There is no one in the East who knows how to fix it." "Quiet, man," said Mitty in a low, cool voice. He sprang to the machine, which was now going pocketa, pocketa, queep, pocketa, queep. He began fingering delicately a row of glistening dials. "Give me a fountain pen," he snapped. Someone handed him a fountain pen. He pulled a faulty piston out of the machine and inserted the pen in its place. "That will hold for 10 minutes," he said. "Get on with the operation." A nurse hurried over and whispered to Renshaw, and Mitty saw the man turn pale. "Coreopsis has set in," said Renshaw nervously. "If you would take over, Mitty?" Mitty looked at him, and at the craven figure of Benbow, who drank, and at the grave, uncertain faces of the two great specialists. "If you wish," he said. They slipped a white gown on him. He adjusted a mask and drew on thin gloves. Nurses handed him shining. "Back it up, Mac. Look out for that Buick." Walter Mitty jammed on the brakes. "Wrong lane, Mac," said the parking lot attendant, looking at Mitty closely. "Gee, yeah," muttered Mitty. He began cautiously to back out of the lane, marked exit only. "Leave her sit there," said the attendant. "I'll put her away." Mitty got out of the car. "Hey, better leave the key." "Oh," said Mitty, handing the man the ignition key. The attendant vaulted into the car, backed it up with insolent skill, and put it where it belonged. "They're so damn cocky," thought Walter Mitty, walking along Main Street. "They think they know everything." Once he had tried to take his chains off outside New Milford, and he had got them wound around the axles. A man had had to come out in a wrecking car and unwind them, a young, grinning garageman. Since then, Mrs. Mitty always made him drive to a garage to have the chains taken off. The next time, he thought, "I'll wear my right arm in a sling. They won't grin at me then. I'll have my right arm in a sling, and they'll see I couldn't possibly take the chains off myself." He kicked at the slush on the sidewalk. "Overshoes," he said to himself, and he began looking for a shoe store. When he came out into the street again with the overshoes in a box under his arm, Walter Mitty began to wonder what the other thing was his wife had told him to get. She had told him twice before they set out from their house for Waterbury. In a way, he hated these weekly trips to town. He was always getting something wrong. Kleenex, he thought? Squibs? Razor blades? No. Toothpaste, toothbrush, bicarbonate, carborundum, initiative, and referendum. He gave it up. But she would remember it. "Where's the what's-its-name?" she would ask. "Don't tell me you forgot the what's-its-name." A newsboy went by shouting something about the Waterbury trial. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory." The district attorney suddenly thrust a heavy automatic at the quiet figure on the witness stand. "Have you ever seen this before?" Walter Mitty took the gun and examined it expertly. "This is my Webley Vickers 5080, he said calmly. An excited buzz ran around the courtroom. The judge rapped for order. "You are a crack shot with any sort of firearms, I believe," said the district attorney insinuatingly. "Objection," shouted Mitty's attorney. "We have shown that the defendant could not have fired the shot. We have shown that he wore his right arm in a sling on the night of the 14th of July. Walter Mitty raised his hand briefly, and the bickering attorneys were stilled. "With any known make of gun," he said evenly, "I could have killed Gregory Fitzhurst at 300 feet with my left hand." Pandemonium broke loose in the courtroom. A woman's scream rose above the bedlam, and suddenly a lovely dark-haired girl was in Walter Mitty's arms. The district attorney struck at her savagely. Without rising from his chair, Mitty let the man have it on the point of the chin. "You miserable cur!" "Puppy biscuit," said Walter Mitty. He stopped walking, and the buildings of Waterbury rose up out of the misty courtroom and surrounded him again. A woman who was passing laughed. "He said puppy biscuit," she said to her companion. "That man said puppy biscuit to himself." Walter Mitty hurried on. He went into an A&P. Not the first one he came to, but a smaller one farther up the street. "I want some biscuit for small young dogs," he said to the clerk. "Any special brand, sir?" The greatest pistol shot in the world thought a moment. "It says puppies bark for it on the box," said Walter Mitty. His wife would be through at the hairdresser's in 15 minutes, Mitty saw in looking at his watch, unless they had trouble drying it. Sometimes they had trouble drying it. She didn't like to get to the hotel first. She would want him to be there waiting for her as usual. He found a big leather chair in the lobby facing a window, and he put the overshoes and the puppy biscuit on the floor beside it. He picked up an old copy of Liberty and sank down into the chair. "Can Germany conquer the world through the air?" Walter Mitty looked at the pictures of bombing planes and of ruined streets. "The cannonading has got the wind up in young Raleigh, sir," said the sergeant. Captain Mitty looked up at him through tousled hair. "Get him to bed," he said wearily, "with the others. I'll fly alone." "But you can't, sir," said the sergeant anxiously. "It takes 2 men to handle that bomber, and the Archies are pounding hell out of the air. Von Richtmann's circus is between here and Solier." "Somebody's got to get that ammunition dump," said Mitty. "I'm going over. Spot of brandy?" He poured a drink for the sergeant and one for himself. War thundered and whined around the dugout and battered at the door. There was a rending of wood, and splinters flew through the room. "A bit of a near thing," said Captain Mitty carelessly. "The box barrage is closing in," said the sergeant. "We only live once, Sergeant," said Mitty with his faint, fleeting smile. "Or do we?" He poured another brandy and tossed it off. "I never see a man could hold his brandy like you, sir," said the sergeant. "Begging your pardon, sir." Captain Mitty stood up and strapped on his huge Webley Vickers automatic. "It's 40 kilometers through hell, sir," said the sergeant. Mitty finished one last brandy. "After all," he said softly, "what isn't?" The pounding of the cannon increased. There was the rat-tat-tatting of machine guns, and from somewhere came the menacing pocket-a-pocket-a-pocket-a of the new flamethrowers. Walter Mitty walked to the door of the dugout, humming "Auprès de ma blonde." He turned and waved to the sergeant. "Cheerio," he said. Something struck his shoulder. "I've been looking all over this hotel for you," said Mrs. Mitty. "Why do you have to hide in this old chair? How did you expect me to find you?" "Things close in," said Walter Mitty vaguely. "What?" Mrs. Mitty said. "Did you get the what's-his-name? The puppy biscuit? What's in that box?" "Overshoes," said Mitty. "Couldn't you have put them on in the store?" "I was thinking," said Walter Mitty. "Does it ever occur to you that I am sometimes thinking?" She looked at him. "I'm going to take your temperature when I get you home," she said. They went out through the revolving doors that made a faintly derisive whistling sound when you pushed them. It was 2 blocks to the parking lot. At the drugstore on the corner, she said, "Wait here for me. I forgot something. I won't be a minute." She was more than a minute. Walter Mitty lighted a cigarette. It began to rain with sleet in it. He stood up against the wall of the drugstore, smoking. He put his shoulders back and his heels together. "To hell with the handkerchief," said Walter Mitty scornfully. He took one last drag on his cigarette and snapped it away. Then, with that faint, fleeting smile playing about his lips, he faced the firing squad. Erect and motionless, proud and disdainful, Walter Mitty the undefeated, inscrutable to the last. Interview with a Lemming. The weary scientist, tramping through the mountains of northern Europe in the winter weather, dropped his knapsack and prepared to sit on a rock. "Careful, brother," said a voice. "Sorry," murmured the scientist, noting with some surprise that a lemming, which he had been about to sit on, had addressed him. "It is a source of constant astonishment to me," said the scientist, sitting down beside the lemming, "that you are capable of speech." "You human beings are always astonished," said the lemming, "when any other animal can do anything you can, yet there are many things animals can do that you cannot, such as stridulate or chirr, to name just one." To stridulate or chirr, one of the minor achievements of the cricket. Your species is dependent on the intestines of the sheep and the hair of the horse. "We are a dependent animal," admitted the scientist. "You are an amazing animal," said the lemming. "We have always considered you rather amazing, too," said the scientist. "You are perhaps the most mysterious of creatures." "If we are going to indulge in adjectives beginning with M," said the lemming sharply, "let me apply a few to your species. Murderous, maladjusted, maleficent, malicious, and muffle-headed. You find our behavior as difficult to understand as we do yours? You, as you would say it, said it," said the lemming. "You kill, you mangle, you torture, you imprison, you starve each other, you cover the nurturing earth with cement, you cut down elm trees to put up institutions for people driven insane by the cutting down of elm trees, You could go on all night like that," said the scientist, listing our sins and our shames. "I could go on all night and up to 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon," said the lemming. "It just happens that I have made a lifelong study of the self-styled higher animal. Except for one thing, I know all there is to know about you, and a singularly dreary, dolorous, and distasteful store of information it is, too, to use only adjectives beginning with D." "You say you have made a lifelong study of my species?" began the scientist. "Indeed I have," broke in the lemming. "I know that you are cruel, cunning, and carnivorous, sly, sensual, and selfish, greedy, gullible, and guileful." "Pray don't wear yourself out," said the scientist quietly. "It may interest you to know that I have made a lifelong study of lemmings, just as you have made a lifelong study of people. Like you, I have found but one thing about my subject which I do not understand." "And what is that?" asked the lemming. "I don't understand," said the scientist, "why you lemmings all rush down to the sea and drown yourselves." "How curious," said the lemming. "The one thing I don't understand is why you human beings don't." You could look it up. It all begun when we dropped down to Columbus, Ohio, from Pittsburgh, to play an exhibition game on our way out to St. Louis. It was getting on into September, and though we'd been leading the league by 6-7 games most of the season, we was now in first place by a margin you could have got it into the eye of a thimble, being only a half a game ahead of St. Louis. Our slump had given the boys the leaping jumps, and they was like a bunch of old ladies at a lawn fete with a thunderstorm coming up, running around snarling at each other, eating bad and sleeping worse, and batting for a team average of maybe 186. Half the time nobody'd speak to nobody else, without it was to bawl 'em out. Squawks McGrew was managing the boys at the time, and he was darn near crazy. They called him Squawks 'cause when things was going bad he lost his voice, or pretty near lost it, and squealed at you like a little girl you stepped on her doll or something. He yelled at everybody and wouldn't listen to nobody, without maybe it was me. I'd been training the boys for 10 year, and he'd take more lip from me than from anybody else. He knowed I was smarter than him anyways, like you're going to hear. This was 31 year ago. You could look it up, because it was the same year Columbus decided to call itself the Arch City, on account of a lot of iron arches with electric light bulbs into them, which stretched across High Street. Thomas Albert Edison sent him a telegram, and they was speeches, and maybe even President Taft opened the celebration by pushing a button. It was a great week for the Buckeye Capital, which was why they got us out there for this exhibition game. Well, we just lose a doubleheader to Pittsburgh, 11-5 and 7-3, so we snarled all the way to Columbus, where we put up at the Chittenden Hotel, still snarling. Everybody was tetchy, and when Billy Klinger took a sock at Whitey Cott at breakfast, Whitey throwed marmalade all over his